We saw in the last talk, and welcome back, that Confucius often describes his way, his Dao, D-A-O, in riddles. A Jewish friend of mine told me a joke about a member of the synagogue who said to the rabbi, "Rabbi, may I ask you a question?" "Yes, my son." "Why do Jews always answer a question with a question?" "Why do you ask, my son?" said the rabbi. Sometimes it feels a bit like this with Confucius. But we did see a clear explanation of Ren, humaneness, in Analects 17:6, where deference, tolerance, making good on one's word, diligence, and generosity were explicitly said to be the qualities of the humane person. But then these terms are not defined in detail, but are described in terms of their effects. If you show deference, you will not be insulted. Yes, when you think about it, that's almost certain to be true. A deferential manner will not excite hostility, whereas a loud or aggressive manner will almost certainly do so, because like begets like. And similarly, if you are tolerant, you will win people over. And if you keep your promises, people will then come to rely on you. And if you are diligent, you will get results, and people will begin to see that in you. So the apparently clear definition proceeds by way of the consequences of these attitudes, which are effectively defined by what happens when they are adopted or present in the demeanour of the humane person. If you keep your promises, people will rely on you. Good common sense. So we're not really given a clear definition in the way that Socrates or Aristotle would like. We're given an insight into what happens in the presence of these qualities. It is a kind of science of behaviour which Confucius is enunciating. And there is none of the essentialist thought which one encounters with Socrates and Plato. They would not look at the consequences of behaviours in trying to outline an ethical code. They would have seen that as trivialising it. They would rather look for an essence or an ideal state of goodness. Once more I mention the book by Iris Murdoch, novelist and philosopher, The Sovereignty of Good. Once this is understood, in their view, definitions and examples can flow from the fundamental understanding. Confucius looks rather at the social effects of certain behaviours, and these effects, of course, taken together, spell a harmonious society. Just look at them. Lack of hostility gives the ability to win people over or create consensus, ability to get people around you because you keep your promises and because you are diligent and effective. All this is a picture of a society working well together. Nonetheless, to return to the first point, there is a certain vagueness about Confucius' way of defining the good path. Let's look at this a bit more. He chooses not to be explicit, not to give formal definitions, which might then become debating points, as in the Athenian schools of philosophy, but to get to the ideas in other ways. We just saw one of these ways, which is to describe the virtues of the good person through the effects of their behaviour. And one could do worse than to look at it in that way, one of the things we most want to understand about ourselves is our effect on other people. And then we want to understand ourselves through the view that other people have of us. So our effects on society and on our own particular social world is certainly what we most want to know. So you might say that Jesus talked about the effects of behaviour too. What he said about the meek, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." When he said this, was he talking in the same way? In a way, yes, because he emphasises the deferential and the idea of the modest demeanour. But he's not talking as a social scientist about meeting the effects of meekness on the society around us. He's talking about the promise and the future expectation, which will go on to be outlined by St. Paul of Tarsus. For Confucius, social consequences are the paramount test. How do we create a harmonious society? There is in all this a Confucian via negativa. By this I mean to refer to the negative theology tradition which grew up in the Christian late antiquity and in the Middle Ages. I already mentioned the docta ignorantia, the learned ignorance. This is a phrase associated with Nicholas of Cusa, a medieval mystical thinker. The via negativa, or the negative way, comes about in late antique Christianity as a part of mysticism, which enters the tradition. In its shortest form, the view is that God is better known by negatives than by positives. That is to say, God is not this and not that, not even good or not even existent. The consistent negation of everything familiar to us leads the mind to become blank. And this is the moment, the mystical moment, at which we can know what God is like, know the unknowable. The via negativa tells us that ordinary language and ordinary descriptors will get us nowhere in understanding that which is way beyond ordinary language. Confucius now seems to have his own via negativa, in that he refrains from direct description or definition. If you look through the Analects, you will see the word not a great deal. The way, the Tao, is not like this or not like that. And I would read the above statement about humaneness, which defines it by its social effects, as just such a strategy in the negative tradition. He seeks to avoid the banal, but more importantly, the specific Confucian via negativa lies in the fact that he seeks to avoid a permanent and immutable definition of goodness, leaving us to endless debates. So he looks to the situation for the self-expression of goodness. If you take the example from the Analects, the ways of the gentleman are three, which I have not accomplished. Being humane, he does not worry. Being wise, he is not perplexed. Being courageous, he does not fear. He's talking about himself, according to the comment made by Zigong in the Analects. But notice the number of nots in the passage. Confucius says of himself that he has not accomplished these things. So that's the first negation. And then he's saying I'm not a paragon of these virtues, and I'm not to be taken as the ideal. So in a sense, we're none the wiser. But the Confucian via negativa would tell us that we are the wiser, because we have not fallen for a false concretization of an ethical model. But there are other knots, 3 in fact. So humaneness is defined as not worrying, and wisdom is defined as not being perplexed, and courage is defined as not fearing. Well, we know what fear is, so we're invited to imagine what not fear is. That negative, or the not, launches us into a deep pool of ideas which are possibly far wider than would have been the case had he simply defined courage in its own right. Aristotle, of course, over in Greece, he would have defined courage. He did, in fact. He was very tidy like that. So Confucius' use of the word not is extremely frequent and is by no means accidental. It's a choice, a way of communicating and a way of explaining which does not fossilize the mind. He very often answers a question with a not. When asked what kind of people he would take along if he were to need a grand army, the master says, not the reckless. He does not answer with a positive. We would call it technically a cataphatic statement. He asks you to imagine the reckless people and think about people who are not like them. But he does not fill in the gap for you. You must exercise your own imagination based on the negative which you have been given as your starting point. This opens up the mind to an infinity of possibilities. Even take a passage which appears to contain a positive assertion like 13:27. The master says, being firm, resolute and honest, and deliberate in speech is close to humaneness, Ren. Whilst that is certainly giving us a picture, there is still a negation hiding in there. These things are only close to humaneness. They're not identical with humaneness. There is no certainty. If he says it's close, that's not telling us what it is. There is the suggestion that we have to imagine something. In other situations, the idea of the negative way emerges similarly through the language of refraining from certain activities, rather than requesting that the way requires one to do certain things. Confucius prefers to concentrate on not doing. For example, one does not violate ritual propriety. We will come to ritual later on and its great importance. And one does not speak about anything that seems to refer to the observance of ritual propriety in a bad way. One does not even listen to anything like that, and one does not even look at something that violates the observance of ritual propriety. You turn away your gaze. This is in Analects 12:1. This is again all about understanding through negation, through negating everyday experience, the common or garden experience of life, when the appropriate rituals are possibly mocked, not respected or honoured. So instead of saying what the appropriate ritual is, the way of humaneness is defined literally as none of that. And finally, there is the cryptic definition of the person of excellence. That person will certainly have something to say, but someone who has something to say is not necessarily an excellent person. The person with humane values is certain to be bold, but someone who is bold is not necessarily humane. So here we are invited to think in terms of positives, but we're warned that the positive might be accompanied by a negative. That boldness of the good person may also be found in the bad person. The good person is bold, but not all bold people are good. And finally, in 5.7, using the translation of leg, I should say a highly contested one, from ctext.org, my doctrines make no way. I will get upon a raft and float about above the sea. Thank you for joining me, and next time we will talk about the subversiveness of goodness, about how it can be politically subversive. Thank you.